It's easy to forget now, but there was once a point in time when Crash Bandicoot sat on equal playing ground with Mario and Sonic as one of the big three mascots in gaming. Created and developed by Naughty Dog for the first ever PlayStation, the original trilogy of Crash games were some of the most beloved and best-selling titles of the late 90s, unanimously considered classic fixtures of video game history. Looking around at the scene today, however, you'd almost never be able to tell that people ever cared about this orange marsupial at all. From 2008 all the way up until 2017, this franchise was completely dead in the water. And while there's been some buzz in recent years thanks to a successful remake of the original trilogy, as well as a brand new direct sequel, to say that the series is back to its glory days would be a lie. So what happened? Well, you see, despite creating the Bandicoot, Naughty Dog did not actually own the property. The rights instead went to Universal. Yes, that Universal, with Naughty Dog only creating those original PS1 games for them as contractors. Once the next generation of consoles flooded the market in the early 2000s, the studio would move on to other projects that they would actually have ownership of, leaving Crash Bandicoot solely in the hands of one of the greediest corporations in the entire entertainment industry. The rest, at this point, is history. Throughout the 2000s, Universal would continue pumping out increasingly bizarre and at times poorly made Crash games on a yearly basis, each one deviating further and further away from the series' roots until they pushed things so far that the entire franchise imploded in on itself. Despite this, the installment that fans have historically felt killed the franchise is ironically the one that didn't do anything different at all. 2002's Crash Bandicoot and the Wrath of Cortex was developed by Traveler's Tales as the fourth main installment in the series, and the first without the involvement of Naughty Dog. It did not go over well. Many critics at the time expressed disappointment that this next-gen Crash Bandicoot game was a one-to-one rehash of its predecessors, resulting in what was basically a clone of Crash 3, but you know, sloppier. The game's reputation would only plummet further as the years went on, soon feeling the wrath of angry internet reviewers claiming it to be one of the worst entries in the entire series, since at least the other bad Crash sequels were doing something unique? 2 decades on, however, I have to ask, is the hate actually deserved? I grew up playing and loving Wrath of Cortex, so when I first found out that this was an infamously hated title, I was shocked. To be honest, I still kind of am shocked. I do understand the criticisms that people have with this game. It's not perfect, and it's definitely a downgrade from the preceding trilogy, but when you consider everything that's happened since, is it really such a bad thing that we got one final game in the same style as the originals, even if it's not quite as good? Today, I want to offer a different perspective. We're gonna analyze Crash Bandicoot and the Wrath of Cortex not as the game where it all went wrong, but as the last game to get things mostly right. Because I still think there's a lot to enjoy here, flaws and all. In terminally online terms, Wrath of Cortex good, actually. Bitch. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have called you that. Can we start over? Okay, so to fully understand what we're dealing with here, I think it's appropriate to establish a little more context. After all, calling Wrath of Cortex a poor man's clone of Crash 3 means basically nothing if we don't at least explore what makes a Crash game good to begin with. It's pretty common knowledge at this point that Super Mario 64 basically invented the modern 3D platformer. Hell, in a lot of ways, it invented 3D gaming as we know it. But what makes the original Crash Bandicoot game interesting is that it was also developed as the first ever 3D platformer, releasing the same month as Mario 64's international debut. This meant that Naughty Dog had basically nothing to go off of when making the game, and you can tell as their approach was vastly different from basically any of its contemporaries. Instead of roaming wide open sandbox levels for collectibles, Crash Bandicoot was heavily modeled after the 2D platformers of old. The only real difference being that now, instead of moving left to right in pursuit of the end of each level, you move forwards. that's it really. This is basically a 2D platformer with the perspective flipped. In fact, a lot of the time it doesn't even adhere to that. A solid chunk of the levels in this game are literally from a 2D perspective with the tiniest bit of wiggle room to move around in 3D. It's a great game, but Wrath of Cortex takes after the sequels far more. Crash 2 and 3 were both developed in a post-Mario 64 world, and while the linear hallway level design philosophy remained the same, pretty much everything around it was altered to reflect this new gaming landscape. For example, in the original Crash Bandicoot game, you progress through each level one by one on a world map, like Donkey Kong Country or Super Mario World. In Crash 2 and 3, however, you now have a small hub world and unlock levels in sets of 5 at a time to be completed in whatever order you feel like, kind of like Mario 64. There was also a shift of focus onto collectible hunting. In Crash 1, you'd be awarded gems for breaking all of the boxes in a level, but that was about it. Crash 2 and 3 also have this mechanic, but now there's a collectible for every objective. Crystals for beating a level, and gems for breaking all the boxes, finding secret paths, reaching certain areas without dying, or completing mini challenges, with Crash 3 adding in another collectible in the form of relics for completing time trial runs. On top of all of these changes, Crash's moveset was vastly expanded, giving the player far greater mobility. Perhaps the most divisive evolution throughout the original trilogy, however, was the increased variation of the core gameplay. You see, in Crash 1, there were these two gimmick levels where you rode on a wild hog automatically barreling down the level, kind of like Subway Surfers decades before Brain Rot existed. They were fun, but a small part of the game. Crash 2 would expand on this animal riding concept while also adding in a few more gimmicks, like the jetboard and jetpack levels. This was all fine and dandy as, again, the main focus was still on linear platforming. Crash 3, however, is where many fans felt things went a bit overboard. In an attempt to keep up with the variety offered by their more open-ended contemporaries, Naughty Dog stuffed over half the game with these divisive vehicle gimmick levels. There are stages where you engage in motorcycle racing, drive a jet ski, fly a plane to shoot down targets, swim underwater, ride dinosaurs, and much, much more. Crash 3 is still a beloved game in the franchise, the typical platforming levels often regarded as what the kids call peak. But where you rank this within the trilogy more or less comes down to how much you can tolerate all of the varied vehicle-based gimmicks. Without having even talked about it yet, you now should have a pretty solid understanding of what Wrath of Cortex actually is. Like Crash 3, it's a linear 3D platformer where you go through 5 sets of 5 hallway-based levels in whichever order you fancy, collecting crystals, gems, and relics while occasionally engaging in some gimmicky vehicle-based gameplay. Crash's moveset is the exact same as it was in Crash 3, there's the exact same amount of content as in Crash 3, and the gameplay loops and mechanics are also the exact same as they were in Crash 3. So why does everyone hate this when Crash 3 is a beloved classic? Well, from what I've gathered over the years, it mainly comes down to the issue of death by 1,000 cuts. There's not really one specific thing that Wrath of Cortex drops the ball on compared to Crash 2 and 3. It's rather a matter of nearly every single element being just a little less polished than before. The graphics aren't as impressive, the controls aren't as tight or fluid, the story is completely disconnected from prior entries when the originals had very strong continuity, the overall gameplay and level design aren't as consistent with gimmicks that feel far more scatterbrained, and I could honestly keep going. This is all true and worth criticizing, but I should emphasize that there's a difference between Wrath of Cortex ruining elements of the Crash formula and merely executing those elements a little sloppier. Personally, I find that most of the game's issues, not all of them, but most, fall into the latter category. Sure, the graphics aren't pushing the hardware to its limit like Crash 2 and 3's were, but it's not like the game looks bad. Besides some admittedly janky character models for the villains, Crash himself looks great, and the level environments are quite pretty for the time. The controls and physics aren't as tight as before, but they aren't ruined either. Honestly, I have trouble even saying they're worse here, just a little different. I played this coming directly off of the PS1 trilogy on original hardware, and honestly, I found Crash just as fun and responsive to control here, despite the difference. The story is often criticized for failing to pick up where Crash 3 left off, something that the Naughty Dog trilogy would always make sure to do, but but the actual plot still tonally matches what you'd expect from a Crash Bandicoot game. It's not like the PS1 trilogy had Shakespearean storytelling anyways, it was mostly just cutscenes of talking heads giving context as to why you're playing the game, which is also the case here, and it works just as well. I do want to reiterate that I'm not arguing Wrath of Cortex deserves to be held to the same standard as the original Naughty Dog trilogy, because it's just not up to that standard. Like I said, it executes nearly every element of the formula worse, and I don't blame people for taking issue with that. My point is that it mostly doesn't get those elements wrong. At the end of the day, Wrath of Cortex is still built on an incredibly strong and beloved foundation, and while it is a sloppier take on it, it still fundamentally understands said foundation and does nothing to outright break it, which is important. Now look, if it really were just Crash 3, but slightly worse in every way, then I wouldn't be here making this video right now. But the thing is, despite its many glaring flaws, Wrath of Cortex actually does have some tricks up its sleeve that gives it inherent value as a legitimate entry in the series. There are aspects of this game that I think were handled better than the original trilogy, new exciting gameplay concepts that bring something fresh to the table, and general quality of life improvements, all of which come together to provide a unique Crash experience without abandoning the Crash mold like later titles would. To start off with just a small improvement, Wrath of Cortex mostly eliminates the intense backtracking found in prior entries. In the original trilogy, you had to find these elusive colored gems found in later parts of the game that would unlock secret paths in earlier levels, allowing you to break all of the crates in them and collect the box gem. This meant that as a new player, you'd often spend time trying to 100% complete a level, only to find out at the end that it was impossible until later in the journey. Wrath of Cortex also does this, but most of the colored gems unlock paths in later levels rather than earlier ones. There's only 2 stages in the entire game that require backtracking, which makes completing the game in one go a lot more straightforward if you know what you're doing. Again, that's just a small improvement, but if there's one thing Wrath of Cortex truly excels at over its predecessors, it's level variety. As great as the original Naughty Dog trilogy is, one thing that's always bothered me a bit is the excessive recycling of stage assets. Crash 1 actually balanced this pretty well, as the game never uses a level theme more than twice and features a number of unique stages that only appear once. It feels like you're constantly seeing something new, and there was a lot of effort put into the visual narrative since every player progressed on the same level by level basis. You start in jungle settings before moving on to ancient ruins, factories, and finally infiltrating Cortex Castle. Crash 2 and 3, however, shifted to a more grab-bag style of level theming, where there is no narrative cohesion and each stage is kinda just doing its own thing. This would be perfectly fine if they committed to it, but despite this shift, both titles are far worse about flipping assets. There are no unique level themes in either game, with most repeating 3 or 4 times over. Nothing is more disappointing than getting to the final warp room of Crash 3 and realizing every single level is an asset flip of something you've already seen before. Like Crash 2 and 3, Wrath of Cortex is going for the grab-bag style of level theming, but unlike those games, it actually commits to the bit and treats each level as its own unique entity. For the first time since Crash 1, there are actual stage themes that only appear once, like the nighttime farmlands of Tornado Alley, the treetop villages of Bamboozled, or the rainforests of Jungle Rumble. These are just a few examples, but having these one-and-done stage aesthetics sets the player up to keep expecting new ideas every level. Even when multiple stages do share the same theme, the devs went through great lengths to make them feel vastly different from each other. A big part of this is the game's soundtrack. Every single level now has its own unique music, so even if 2 share the same aesthetics, the different scores helps them to actually stand out from each other. This alone already makes each level more memorable and exciting, but the biggest source of variety in Wrath of Cortex comes from perhaps its most divisive aspect. So remember earlier when I said that Crash 3 has a bit of a reputation for going overboard with the gimmicky vehicle levels? Well, Wrath of Cortex bumps that up to 110%, featuring over a dozen vehicles, and most people are not a fan of this. In fact, this tends to be one of the biggest complaints that critics lobby towards the game, and it's easy to see why. Due to the sheer amount of vehicles in the game, the vast majority of them only show up once or twice, which kind of gives the game a bit of a scatterbrained vibe, like the developers were just throwing random ideas at the wall with no caution. For me, however, that's what makes Wrath of Cortex so enthralling compared to its predecessors. You truly never know what to expect when entering a level, as the game is constantly throwing new ideas, concepts, and aesthetics at you up until the very end of the game. Now, admittedly, some of these ideas do kind of suck. Many critics will point to the submarine, which has this truly awful mechanic where when you're trying to turn around, you have to pointlessly face the camera first and then hit the input again before you can fully turn. It's as stiff and cumbersome as it sounds. Luckily though, outside of the submarine, the vast majority of the vehicle gimmicks in this game are actually pretty fun. Or at worst, just inoffensive, which is still not bad. Plus, since most of them only appear once or twice, they never overstay their welcome. It's not like there's disproportionately more vehicle-based gameplay in Wrath of Cortex either. When you do the math, it's really the same ratio of platforming to vehicle gameplay as there was in Crash 3. The only difference is that there's way more vehicle variety and they kind of flow in and out of levels instead of each stage being strictly a platforming level or strictly a vehicle level like it was in Crash 2 and 3. Anyways, to get back to my point from earlier, the vehicles really help levels with shared themes feel completely different from each other. For example, there are 5 snow levels in the game, but each one has a unique gimmick. The first is a normal Crash platforming level, the second is a ball rolling stage, the third has you controlling Crash's sister Coco, who has a slightly different moveset, the fourth has you in a hover pack racing a polar bear on a magic carpet through rings, and the final one has you snowboarding as Coco from an isometric perspective. Sure, they're all snow levels, but each one feels completely distinct from the last. The only 2 stages I can think of that share a theme without doing anything different are the Gauntlet and Wizards and Lizards, but again, they still stand out from each other due to their unique music tracks. Speaking of, another one of Wrath of Cortex's greatest strengths is its soundtrack. Even the biggest haters of this title will admit that the music absolutely slaps, and personally it's one of my favorite game soundtracks of all time, taking the musical stylings of its predecessors and merging it together with early 2000s house and electronic music. Even in the game's most frustrating moments, the bopping OST makes it hard for me to really get upset. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that while Wrath of Cortex isn't on the same level of quality as the original trilogy, it's still a good Crash game in the grand scheme of things. It's built on the same exact foundation as those classic PS1 titles, and while it executes most aspects of that formula with less polish, it doesn't ruin any of them to the point where the game is no longer fun to play. It's like going from a 9 out of 10 to a 7 out of 10. It's a downgrade, but the end result is still fun in its own right. I don't think the backlash was necessarily undeserved at the time, but I do find it odd that this title is still a bit of a punching bag online, when in my opinion, it bodies nearly any other Crash game that's come since. Future titles would more or less forget what made this franchise fun to begin with, drastically overhauling or abandoning aspects of the formula to the point where it doesn't even feel like the same series anymore. Even the recent Crash Bandicoot 4 had serious issues, with its horrifically unfriendly 100% completion requirements and wild difficulty spikes. 22 years later, and I'm still waiting on another game like Wrath of Cortex that understands what made the original trilogy so much fun to replay over and over again. But you know, live service online battle royale games are cool too, I guess. Fuck me, man. Anyways, thanks for watching. Remember to drink water, get some sunlight, and give Wrath of Cortex a positive review on Metacritic. Come on guys, we can get her in the green, I know it! Until then, I've been GregCubed, and I'll see you next time.